Afternoon. I'm Penny Bishop. I'm Dean of the Boston University Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. Welcome to this month's edition of Conversations with the Dean. In this webinar series, we focus on a range of important topics within education. Our discussions reflect BU Wheelock's deep commitment to transforming systems, particularly those that are inequitable. And each of our webinars focuses on the complexity of a particular issue, and we seek to uncover the transformational opportunities to see students and communities thrive. Before we get to today's topic, however, I wanted to share some brief but exciting news. For those of you who regularly tune in, you may recall a really fun conversation that we had last month with Nermeen Dashush and Nika Bolden about their work with PBS Kids and Lila in the Loop, and that in particular. And we recently learned that they've received an Emmy nomination for their work in the interactive media category. So cross your fingers with us for an exciting outcome from that nomination. So on to our regularly scheduled programming. We know from research and experience that high quality school and district leadership is a critical driver of student success. This afternoon, we'll explore how research and practice intersect to develop effective leaders. And we'll learn some strategies for strengthening leadership, including actionable insights to implement in your own school or district for those of you who are currently practicing. We are joined today by two wonderful faculty members in BU Wheelock's Education Leadership Department. Both are uniquely qualified to speak on this topic. Dr. Olivia Chi is a highly regarded researcher who, among other things, studies educator labor markets and evaluates policies that reduce educational inequality. Dr. Chi is affiliated with the Wheelock Educational Policy Center, or as we like to refer to it, WEPIC. And prior to embarking on research and higher ed focus, she taught elementary grades in New Haven, Connecticut. We also are joined by Dr. Jalene Tamerat, who is on the faculty also of BU Wheelock and is the director of the Carol Johnson Leadership Fellowship. This fellowship was co-designed. It's a collaboration between Boston University and Boston Public Schools. It focuses on developing leadership capacities among educators within BPS. Dr. Tamerat joined Boston University from Northeastern University, where she led faculty development for service learning and for research. She was also Dean of Sposato Graduate School of Education, and she began her career in 2003 as a middle school science teacher in Boston Public Schools, later becoming Director of New Teacher Development. So you can see that we have two folks here who are very well positioned to dive into today's topic. Welcome, Olivia and Jalene. I am looking forward to our conversation, as is our audience, I'm sure. To our audience, please feel free to pose any questions you have in the Q&A box, and as always, we'll try our best to address them. So I'd love to start by hearing a little bit, Jalene and Olivia, about how you each got into this work, how both of your paths have brought you to studying and supporting school leadership. And Olivia, let's start with you.
Thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here in conversation with both of you, so thanks for having me. To give a little background on how I got here, as you mentioned, many years ago, prior to starting my research career, I was an elementary school teacher. And working as a teacher really raised a lot of questions for me about, why is the teaching workforce the way it is? Like, why are our pipelines structured the way that they are? And this really influenced me to study teacher labor markets. But no surprise to anybody who's worked at a school. A huge part of my teaching experience was really shaped by the leadership of that school. And so when we think about having a healthy educator workforce, like a huge part of that is having this healthy leadership pipeline of workforce. And so for years, I've been studying, mostly teacher-related topics. And more recently, I've had the opportunity to partner with the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. I'll call it DESE from here, to study leadership pipelines. And I really wanted to jump at this opportunity to work with a great partner, and also think more deeply about school leadership, since it matters so much for the overall health of that educator workforce.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Jalene, how about you? What was your path in?
Yeah, so if I go back a little bit and think about my professional upbringing, starting with the time that I was a science teacher in Boston Public Schools. I spent the majority of my teaching years at the Josiah Quincy Upper School in Chinatown. And I was under the leadership of Dr. Bok Fun Wong, who is kind of a storied figure in BPS, but he was somebody who had some rather unconventional ways of thinking about and really organizing his school when it came to leadership. Besides him as the school leader, we didn't have other administrators in the building. Instead, we had a teacher leadership model where a number of us kind of rotated in and out of administrative and leadership capacities within the school. So I was very fortunate to try on leadership of a school during the time that I was a teacher at that school. Fast forward a little bit, when I ended up at the central office in BPS and I was working as the director of new teacher development, my program was housed in the recruitment, cultivation, and diversity RCD department. And the new teacher development program was kind of part of a portfolio of initiatives that really constituted a pipeline of leadership development for people connected to BPS from the high school level as high school students all the way up to leaders in the district. And it was there that I was able to balance a lot of what I came to understand about leadership from Dr. Wong with a more kind of conventional way of thinking about teacher leadership that followed a more or less linear trajectory.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that just listening to both of you talk, how you're underscoring the influence of the building-based leader when you were teachers certainly resonates with me as well as a former middle school teacher. You know, the principal in particular really played a significant role in shaping how I thought about the art and science of teaching, and also, of course, the climate in the building. And yet I will say that I don't know that I thought deeply at that point about the pipeline. And yet, of course, we know how critical that is to building successful schools. So yeah, I love hearing how you each came to it. So thank you for that. I'm wondering, Olivia, if you could maybe help us start to dig into this topic by giving us a bit of an overview on the state of school leadership here in the Commonwealth. I know you recently published a school leadership pipeline snapshot for the state. What were some big takeaways for you from that work?
So the snapshot our team worked on, it really focuses on like key facts and figures about both principals and assistant principals in Massachusetts public schools. And just to give, just to throw out some numbers out there, we have about 1,700 principals roughly, and roughly 1,600 assistant principals. And this was a number from the 2022-23 school year. And so I encourage anybody who's listening to check it out. It's publicly posted on the Wheelock Educational Policy Center's website. And we have a handful of facts about prep and licensure and career paths, but a couple of interesting highlights. One is focusing on the trend in race and ethnicity among our principals and assistant principals. So between 2014-15, through 2022-2023, the share of school leaders who identify as people of colors increased. And so for principals, it went from roughly 9% up to 13% over that time. For assistant principals, it went from roughly 10% to 14%. And yes, I think there's still a lot of work to do. It does not mirror the current population of students that are being served by the state. It's not close to that. But I think that it does indicate that there has been progress around this goal of increasing the diversity of the broader educator workforce. So I think that there are a lot of initiatives in place across the state from, the state level, district level, local levels, like grassroots groups have all been pushing towards increasing diversity. And I think we see some of that in the numbers. Mm-hmm. And so, unsurprisingly, urban schools, as opposed to rural, town and suburban schools, they have a much higher share of leaders who are people of color. And so there is much more concentration in urban schools, which I think isn't super surprising to the folks on this call.
Mhm.
And then the other trends I'd love to turn our attention to, which sort of matter, thinking about the other part of the pipeline, thinking about retention, right? So between the school year 2021-22 and 2022-23, so like taking into consideration a little bit of an asterisk, this was, during the pandemic, a lot of things were going on. Um, but just to throw another number out there, about 20% of principals and APs left their positions between those two school years. So think of like 1 in 5 leader is making some sort of transition.
Mm.
And something that I think could be concerning is that among those who are transferring, so those who are moving from one role to another in a different school, we see that they tend to move towards more advantaged schools, meaning
Mm.
when they're moving schools, they go to schools with higher test scores and lower shares of low income students. And so, again, like this, for some, this might not be a surprising finding, but I think that it could be worrying, and that like if we think that having some experience on the job is a good thing, what we're seeing is that those who are transferring are kind of taking their experience with them to more advantaged schools. And so where does that leave schools that have, that are serving students with higher shares of low income students? So trying to think about the equitable distribution of principals and assistant principals with experience, I think there's something, there's work to be done there.
Mhm.
And then finally, turning our attention to the retention of newly hired principals, shifting gears a little bit, thinking of folks who are coming in fresh, we see that about 2 out of 3 principals remain in a principal role in the state about 5 years after they're hired. And so uh, I think what's also, again, like could be concerning is that we see lower retention in the
Mm.
principalship among Black and Hispanic newly hired principals compared to white principals. And again, like this makes me wonder about what are the supports in place in these schools and in these districts to help support these principals, and how do we serve those leaders to help give them what they need to stay in their schools if that's what they want to be doing, right? And to zoom out for a second, about 2 out of 3 remain in the principalship 5 years later. But it's important to note that about 80% still are working and remaining in Massachusetts public schools. So like some aren't just like leaving and disappearing from Massachusetts public schools. Some of them are getting promoted to district leadership positions. Some may, try out leadership and return to educator, like more teaching roles. But it also means that about 20%, so like 1 in 5, are no longer working in Massachusetts public schools 5 years after they became a principal.
Mm.
And so it makes me wonder about things like principal burnout and how that plays a role. It makes me think about what supports could theoretically be there to help, keep folks in place and keep them in their roles if that's, sort of what they're meant to be doing. And so I threw a lot out there, focusing a little bit on diversity and focusing a little bit on retention. But I think that those were some of the major highlights in thinking about the overall picture of what's going on in leadership in our state.
That is such a helpful overview. Thank you so much, Olivia. For those of you who might not have noticed, there's a link to this snapshot in the chat. So you'll want to click into that and take a look at the snapshot. It's like an infographic with great information in it. And yeah, it strikes me that you really do have to, listening to you, it's really an issue of both retention and recruitment and retention, right? It's like turning on the tap and then making sure the pipe doesn't leak. And it's very similar, of course, to what we experience with educators as well, the educator pipeline. So that was really helpful. And it also strikes me that you are really really two great people to talk about it, because Jalene, of course, you've been doing work in this area. So I'd love to maybe have you think about, Jalene, the work that you're doing, the work that you're leading with the BPS Carol Johnson Fellowship, because I think that is designed in many ways to address some of those key takeaways that Olivia just emphasized. So tell us a little bit about that work.
Sure, absolutely. So the Carol Johnson Fellowship is a new initiative. We are supporting and working with our inaugural cohort of 14 fellows right now. And it is a majority teacher of color cohort. I'm not sorry, not teacher of color, leader of color cohort that's made up roughly of about 50% school leaders and 50% district leaders. It's a cohort model that we follow, and the fellows are very bonded to each other. It is a very supportive space. It's a very collaborative space. It's a very affirming space. It is, by design, a retention strategy for the district, because it is providing this, this space where people can come together on a weekly or more basis for their coursework, but we embed opportunities for people to connect, to share both challenges and successes with each other, to support each other as they are thinking about their career trajectories and their ambitions, and really be able to kind of collectively push each other to grow and expand. The other thing that I think is really helpful when it comes to the prospect of supporting the retention of these leaders in the district is that it gives them, through opportunities to shadow other systems level leaders in BPS, to get a more global understanding of the different, types of work that people engage in, the different kind of systems thinking that they have to engage in that may not be on the fellows' radar currently. It's giving them an opportunity to think about and to imagine themselves in a systems level role, understand in a really transparent way what steps need to be taken for them to ascend to those positions, and get in contact with the people and learn from the people in the district who can tell them exactly how to get there. Like, what does it take in terms of the, technical kind of understandings that they need to have, but also what are the adaptive challenges that they need to make sure that they recognize and address for themselves in order to be able to step into those roles. So it's really an opportunity to tether people to the district because it allows them to connect with others who can support them in their growth, but also be able to envision and have a clear understanding of what it would take for them to stay in the district over an extended period of time and be able to leverage the kind of agency that they have as leaders, or can potentially have as they grow in their positions into systems roles that can transform the district positively.
I really appreciate how you're each caring deeply about this and at the same time coming from different vantage points. And there's a lot of value in that. I wonder if you might consider telling us a little bit about how you're each defining effective school leadership. It'd be interesting to see how that differs, if at all. Jalene, you want to start?
Okay, sure. So I think an effective school leader is someone who can kind of think about their role as one of, they have to understand kind of the technical aspects of the work and how the system works. So they have to have that understanding and that ability to kind of navigate systems, understand like what it takes to transform systems, but also like who needs to be brought to the table if they're not already there. They have to have emotional intelligence. They have to have self-awareness. They have to understand the varied perspectives of the people that they encounter and are working with, whether it's people who are working within their schools, teachers, paraprofessionals, other staff members, etc. If they're in a systems level role, understand, the implications of school leadership and school functioning. They also need to understand their communities as a stakeholder group, understand students, understands the communities that they're connected to, and be able to work with and inspire those students and communities to be able to make transformative change, not just for the school or for the district, but for the broader community. So really understanding that ecosystem while kind of balancing that with this like knowledge of how the systems work and understand how the systems can change and what processes could look like that will enact changes and lead to better outcomes.
A really easy job, in other words.
You have to know everything and how to do everything, right?
No, it's really, really, it's so insightful. Thank you, Jalene. How does that resonate for you, Olivia? What are you seeing from your vantage?
Yeah, so coming at this, as a quantitative researcher who's using, large administrative data sets, like the way that I guess like the research tradition that I'm coming from makes us think about like the effectiveness of a school leader is really just about trying to capture what a school leader's effect is on, teacher outcomes, student outcomes, and other things that happen at that school level. But I think I have like a really unsatisfying response to follow up on this, in that in terms of the measures that we have in trying to capture this at scale using data on a large scale, I don't think that we as researchers have the methods to really be able to capture this really well in terms of like it being reliable or unbiased or however you want to talk about having a great measure of the effectiveness of a school leader. I don't think that like where we are in the research and the methodology allows us to really get at that in a really satisfying way. There's been a lot of really excellent research by some other folks out there that have cast doubt on our ability to use like statistics, like and administrative data to try to estimate what we're calling the effect of having, one principle versus a different principle. Like this is just essentially, it's really hard to disentangle what's the effect of a leader versus other things that go on that are beyond a school leader's control. All this to say, like trying to get at some quote unquote objective measure, I think is something that is very that our field is like struggling with right now. It's very much I think a big like a big difficulty in trying to study school leadership from where I'm coming from. That being said, there are lots of other what we think of as more subjective measures, like ratings of principals by their teachers or ratings of principals by their supervisors, whether it be superintendents or other district leaders and so forth. And those measures they do tend to capture other outcomes that we care about. Like they capture things like teacher retention, they capture things like teacher satisfaction, and they capture things like the likelihood of a principal staying. And so there are these other subjective measures that seem to have some predictive power, like they can tell us something about what we think is going to happen. But that being said, like none of these measures on their own are perfect, right? And so I think from the research side, the quantitative lens that I'm bringing in many ways, we have a lot of things available. None of the measures are totally satisfying, but the hope is that we will be making progress and trying to get a handle on this really important question of like, how do we measure and quantify and how do we talk about who is an effective school leader and who is a less effective school leader and how do we think about improving that? And so really is kind of like a struggling point for some of like the research side of where we're coming from to try to measure these things at scale. Yeah, and it's a pretty tricky thing for the field right now. And so I feel like that's a little bit unsatisfying, but it is kind of the reality, the nature of the game is like, I think that there's so much to be learned on how we're trying to capture, measure, and improve these things.
Let me just dig a little bit deeper into that for a moment, because you both sort of highlighted the importance of diversity and diverse leadership in various contexts. Certainly, Olivia, you helped us understand the demographics a bit, and Jalene, you also helped us think a little bit about it in terms of the fellowship being predominantly leaders of color and that cohort. We have one question from the audience, from Anthony, who mentions that, of course, we all know that representation matters, but that what we represent matters as well. And he's asking to what extent are increases in leadership diversity associated with equitable practices or culturally responsive practices. Olivia, do you know the research on that at all? Is there something that you could add to this conversation?
I wish I had again, like I wish I had a better read of this. I don't think I have an answer to that direct question. Something that I do know is that uh, the race and other characteristics like gender, those things do seem to matter for things like teacher retention, teacher evaluation. I've done some work looking at teacher evaluation that front, and other folks have looked at teacher retention and the race of a principal also seems to matter for which teachers are being hired into the school. And so thinking about and some of that evidence suggests that it comes through like networks, right? And so in the sense that we do care not just about leadership diversity, we care about teacher and educator diversity. Having more diverse leaders also seems to matter a lot for having more diverse teachers and educators in a school. And so like to the extent that you can sort of trace that from leaders, teachers, and practices, we think that all of those things matter. I don't have something off the top of my head that like makes that direct connection as Anthony's asking for, but a lot of recent work has come out showing how important it is for having racially and ethnically and gender diverse principals because that matters so much for the people that they interact with daily, meaning like that teacher workforce.
Thank you. Jalene, how about from your experience and your work with leaders? What's your takeaway on that?
Yes, well, I can say that anecdotally, I would probably say that practices, and I think, well, first of all, hello, Anthony. Anthony is one of our amazing cohort members of the fellowship.
Oh my gosh.
Great question. I will say that anecdotally that leadership diversity could correlate with practices that decenter white supremacy. Um, but as as we all know, that like there are going to be kind of variations within any subgroup of leaders. So it is important to have the representation that Anthony is mentioning in his question. But I think with opportunities to like grow and develop leaders, and specifically for, fellowships like the BPS, the Carol Johnson Leadership Fellowship. I think that we're very intentional about centering equity and decentering kind of white supremacy culture and practices in our coursework and instruction. And so, with the advancement of programs for learning and development like that touch kind of a number of potential leaders or leaders in the district, that we will see a proliferation of leaders who will be able to, to decenter white supremacy culture. So.
Thank you. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, this is we have another question from the audience that links to this particular focus on equity-based work, and they're wondering, Molly's wondering if either of you are doing work on BPS's strategic plan to promote equity and close achievement gaps. Molly reminds us that this starts with school leadership, so it'd be interesting to hear what that looks like. Either of you have a take on that?
I personally, am not, am not involved in this strategic planning process, but I will say that our fellows have opportunities through many of their courses, but in particular through their culminating like capstone project, which we call the transformation project. They are working in small groups to devise a proposal that at the end of summer, this upcoming summer, they will be, presenting to a mock school committee. And the subgroups that they've kind of been divided into are groups that are focusing explicitly on either multilingual students, students with disabilities, or Black students. And they are devising an intervention that is going to address the particular needs of that subgroup. And whatever they end up proposing and presenting in their mock school committee presentation will be, of course, received by upper leadership in BPS, and taken into account and in consideration. And our goal is to have some of kind of what is proposed be able to inform BPS's strategic plans around equity and achievement gaps and closing achievement gaps.
Terrific. Well, it's a pretty inspiring glimpse into what's happening in that Carol Johnson Fellowship. So I appreciate those examples very much. I'm going to take a bit of a turn here. Olivia, I know some of your research has focused on the assistant principalship, and I'm wondering what you're learning in this space and how it might be connected to how we think about effective leadership.
So just like I said before, capturing, a measure of effectiveness is like a very hard problem in the space where I work. But something that I think we generally care about is retention, right? In general, you could imagine cases where turnover can be good. Like if somebody isn't a right fit for that school, you might think that it could be a good thing. But in general, like we think stability in school leadership is a good thing to have. And so in some ongoing current work, I'm examining the retention of newly hired principals. And one thing that we're trying to look at is, does it seem to matter whether or not your newly hired principal who's coming in with some assistant principal experience or not? Right. So there are some folks that go directly into the principalship role from, whether you're a teacher or you're a coach or whatever it may be. And there's some other folks who do the stepping stone of you're an assistant principal for a while and then you become a principal. And so in sort of this ongoing work, so it hasn't been, it's not fully out there yet. So I'll put that little asterisk on it. But what we're seeing is that newly hired principals who are coming in with assistant principalship experience, they seem to be more likely to stay in the principalship a few years later. And it could be for different reasons, right? Like one, you could imagine that the assistant principalship could be like a training experience, right? Like you get a glimpse of what leadership is like. You have the opportunity to, see a principal in action. You get a sense of what to do on the job once you're in it. And so you could think of it as like, valuable training. On the other hand, it could also be, you could also think of it as like, it could be like a vetting experience, right? Where people get a glimpse of what leadership looks like, and maybe they decide whether or not they want to stay in AP or continue as an educator in the classroom, or whether they, decide that they can decide whether or not pursuing a principal role is for them or not. And so you could think of having the AP experience as serving, both as a training ground. It could potentially also be like a vetting experience. Either way, like we could see, you could imagine that having this AP experience could be beneficial. And what we're seeing so far is just descriptively, we're seeing that those with that AP experience seem to be staying in the principal job longer. And so what we're trying to do is trying to get a sense of using the data of like, why do we think this is? And we're trying to look at potential explanations of it. But so far, that's kind of like the fact pattern that we're seeing is that there is, potentially an advantage to coming in with that AP experience. And so I'd love to ask Jalene, like, does this, if at all, does it resonate with what you've seen in your experience? And whether it's in the fellowship or your prior work, does this resonate with what you see in schools and districts and prep programs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a world in which we could conceive of like and maybe it requires a little bit more structuring and naming of this, like naming of the thing on our part. But, the AP experience, it could be like a practicum, right? You could have, that time if we're really intentional about it. Assistant principals could spend a portion of their time. I know that, traditionally assistant principals are oftentimes like operational, like focused, and other times are instructional focused. But it might be interesting to look at if there is a school that exists like this, or think about, maybe implementing this in a school somewhere. Thinking about how to have the AP experience, one where you are having an opportunity to gain expertise in both operations, instruction, maybe some other competencies that will uniquely prepare assistant principals for the principalship should they decide to pursue that option. it makes a lot of intuitive sense to me that, if you have spent time in an AP role, that like you'd have, an easier time stepping into a principalship because there won't be as much of a learning curve. You will have spent some time learning about some aspect of school leadership. Um, and that's one less thing for you to kind of learn and understand as you're stepping into a new leader role. So it definitely makes sense to me and resonates. Um, we do expect people who are learning to become teachers to spend that kind of time as an apprentice of sorts or in a practicum. And I think that it's important for us to think about, opportunities that are embedded in the AP role to do something similar.
Let's just take another slight turn. I'd like to come at this from the policy angle. What is, there are obviously a lot of complexities at play within the education system. What's maybe one policy or practice, for that matter, at the district or state level that you think is promising, promising, likely to help provide more high quality leaders, something that we might take away as sort of a kernel of an idea that is promising? Either one of you, jump on in.
I wanted just quickly draw attention. So I know that there's a note in the chat. So I just want to point out, like Massachusetts did issue new competencies for the training and preparation of school leaders.
Okay.
That's aligned with anti-racist leadership competencies. So I encourage folks to check those out. I think there's a link in the chat right now. And so I think that's, I think there's potential there, right? And then something else I just wanted to flag too is that something that I find really interesting, like to what you're speaking to, Penny, is that in Massachusetts, I believe in 2023, DESE started to allow educators to become administrators with something they call the provisional license. And so effectively what that's doing, it's allowing individuals to start in an administrator role, whether that's a principal or an assistant principalship, before completing, all of the traditional licensure requirements, specifically focusing on this, the portfolio assessment that is required in Massachusetts. We call it the PAL. And so they're able to, once they've completed those other requirements, they can begin their leadership role before they, are done with their PAL portfolio. And something that we're really interested in looking at is that, does this change, the look of who's entering the pipeline, right? Does changing the requirements have anything to do with changes in, who gets the licenses, who becomes employed with these licenses? Because, some folks, like, they otherwise wouldn't be eligible, or they'd have to wait a long time to complete all of these tasks that are part of this portfolio. And so something that is sort of on our agenda is to take a look at the extent to which this new change in the availability of the provisional license for leaders, whether or not this is changing anything on the recruitment side of the pipeline. And so that's something that we're really excited to look at. And we hope to, and so I guess for everybody, stay tuned, right? That's something that we're excited to take a look at.
Thanks, Olivia. Jalene?
Yes. So one of the other kind of things that I'm involved in that is related to school leadership and district leadership, actually, is I'm part of a consulting team that is working with DESE to support their teacher diversification grant. So along with some other collaborators, are leading professional development and coaching districts across the Commonwealth, all focused on explicitly focusing on retention of educators of color in the district. And we, as a consulting team, have been very adamant about the focus on retention over recruitment, because we find that, recruitment isn't always the issue for a lot of schools and districts. Like, we in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts have a fair amount of, you know, educators of color who are very much interested in entering the profession, want to give back, want to connect with young people. And I know, Olivia, you could pull up the data that shows that like a lot of educators of color that enter these roles don't end up staying for a significant period of time. And so we're really instructing the district and school leaders that are part of this teacher diversification grant to really investigate the conditions on the ground, look at data to be able to identify, what are the trends that are happening in your schools? Why are people leaving? What systems do you have in place that either work to kind of move people out of the district versus keeping them in the district? And, through coaching and instruction, we're working with individual districts to make sure that, they are engaging in some strategic planning and development of interventions, all based around a theory of change that they devise that, that will enable them to be able to, retain the number of educators of color that stay within their district. And so I think that this teacher diversification grant is a wonderful opportunity that the Commonwealth, that DESE has been leading for a number of years. And I hope that it doesn't go away anytime soon, because it does, put the money where their mouths are, right? If we want to invest in increasing the diversity of educators in districts across the Commonwealth, we have to be able to give people opportunities to and support to be able to make good on, what they are intending to do. So, and that's like one thing that I think is really important to continue if we can.
Yeah, very, very promising. Thank you both. As we start to wind down and run out of time, which is always sooner than I would like, I do want to point out a couple of things. So that the Teacher Diversification Grant link is in the chat for those of you who haven't seen that. It's important to click into that before we go, and also the state's recent Educator Diversity Act, which was recently passed as well, that really is focused on the recruitment and retention of educators of color. So really important to click into those, learn a little bit more if there are things that you don't already know about, because they're great resources there. I can't thank you enough, Olivia and Jalene. You've given us a lot to think about, and really helped us think about leadership, school leadership from both research and practice standpoints. And I can't underscore enough how I'm sure that our audience is quite engaged. I'm sorry, speaking of audience, that we didn't get to all of the questions. It's inevitable that we never can fit them all in, but please feel free to reach out. As always, we're always happy to take emails after the fact. Olivia and Jalene, Wheelock is so lucky to have you both on the faculty. Really look forward to your continued impact in this area. I'd also like to thank the audience for your participation. And if you'd like to learn more about our programming in this area in particular, check out our Wheelock Educational Policy Center, or WEPIC, as I mentioned. Or if you're interested in exploring an advanced degree, here are some resources. And finally, I hope to see you all for our next Conversations with the Dean webinar, where we'll talk more about education within the context of the new administration. Thanks so much. Enjoy your day.